Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 234, Sheila Chisholm. Sheila Chisholm was referred to in the papers of the day as a notable Australian socialite. A book was written about her, Sheila, the Australian Beauty Who Bewitched British Society, by Robert Wainwright in 2014. Sheila Chisholm was born Margaret Sheila McKellar Chisholm on the 9th of September 1898 in Sydney to Harry Chisholm and Margaret McKellar. Margaret was the great-granddaughter of Corporal James Chisholm, who was born in Scotland in January 1772. On the 14th of November 1788, at the age of 16, Corporal Chisholm enlisted in the 29th Regiment of Foot with a letter of recommendation. He was transferred to the New South Wales Corps, commanded by Francis Gross, at the Fortin Barracks at Gosport on the 11th of July 1790, with a rank of private, and his occupation was a tailor. James Chisholm travelled to New South Wales as part of the 3rd Fleet contingent of the New South Wales Corps as a guard of convicts on the whaler Britannia, leaving Portsmouth on the 27th of March and arriving at Port Jackson on the 14th of October 1791. In 1793, James Chisholm assisted the Surveyor General, Baron Augustus Ault, to set out town allotments along Spring Row, which was later known as George Street in Sydney. These lots were adjacent to the new parade ground and barracks and were allocated to 6 non-commissioned members of the New South Wales Corps, including one for Chisholm himself, where he resided between 1821 and 1822. At this time he undertook duties of a tailor, and by July 1798 he was promoted to corporal, becoming Master Tailor of the New South Wales Corps, operating this function from the establishment in Spring Row. On the 26th of January 1806, at the age of 34, he married 21-year-old Mary Brown, the daughter of a Scottish free settler, David Brown. James Chisholm was illiterate at the time of his marriage, but under Mary's tutelage, he was later able to read and write as early as 1808, when he was promoted to sergeant, and in that year he commenced dealing as an agent in real estate, and he obtained his first rural land grant at the Eastern Farms and began trading in agricultural commodities. In February 1809, he purchased for £140 the lease on 2 town lots measuring and adjacent to his own land in Spring Row. On the 5th of March 1809, he obtained a licence to retail wine and spirits that he later named the Crown and Thistle. This was a licence that he held continuously until 1822. With the arrival of Colonel Lachlan Macquarie as Governor of New South Wales on the 11th of February 1810, James Chisholm requested and received his discharge from the Army after 21 years of service. He never returned to military service nor the tailoring trade. With the support of Colonel Fulvaux, Macquarie also renewed the leases to Chisholm's land in George Street, as it was renamed in that year, and Macquarie, in a concerted effort to shut down the rum trade, restricted the number of persons that licensed to retail spirits. However, James Chisholm was one of only 20 liquor licences issued on the 16th of February 1810. As a consequence of his mercantile interests, he was an early agitator for monetary reform and the establishment of a colonial currency. He also began to accumulate town and country real estate in his own right, eventually spending some £12,000 on land, and he owned 23,000 acres stretching from the county of Cumberland to the southern Tablelands. By the late 1820s, Chisholm was one of the 6 largest landholders in New South Wales, and by the 1880s, his descendants owned over 3,000 square miles of Australia, stretching from the Gulf of Carpentaria into the state of Victoria. With a few minor setbacks, the diversity of his business allowed him to weather the economic crisis of 1812 to 1815, and he became a wealthy and influential Sydney merchant. His wife Mary died on the 17th of December 1817, aged only 32. So in August 1818, now 46, he married his second wife, the 21-year-old Mary Bowman, the daughter of John and Honor Bowman of Archerfield near Richmond in New South Wales. The Bowmans had arrived as free immigrants on the Barwell in 1798. In 1817, Chisholm was one of the principal merchants invited by Governor Macquarie to a meeting that led to the formation of Australia's first trading bank. In June 1822, Chisholm sold his spirits licence to Mary Reeby, who I did an episode on, episode 44, The Lady on the $20 Note, if you'd like to know more about Mary. So after selling his spirit licence to Mary Reeby, he leased his Crown and Thistle Inn to the newly formed Bank of New South Wales, where it conducted business until 1853. James Chisholm was an original shareholder of the bank, and he later became director in 1826. In 1821 and 1822, James Chisholm commenced building a country house on his 57-acre Newtown farm, which is today's suburb of Redfern. The home he built on it was called Calder House, after the Torphichen mansion in Scotland, and it became his principal residence for the remainder of his life. Calder House was destroyed by fire in 1923. In 1823, James Chisholm constructed a 3-storey stone townhouse next to the Bank of New South Wales at 85 George Street in Sydney. In addition to his interests in the Bank of New South Wales, Chisholm became a founding shareholder in the Bank of Australia in July 1826 and later a trustee of the Savings Bank of New South Wales, which opened on the 18th of August 1832 next to his 3-storey house next door to the trading bank. He had a long and active involvement in the colonial court system of New South Wales. He was one of 2 members of the Governor's Court, appointed by Governor Macquarie, and a member of the grand juries and the juries of the Quarter Session Courts, and he became the first foreman in 1824. In 1827, James Chisholm was granted a little over 2,000 acres of land in what is now known as Smithfield, and the village was initially called Chisholm's Bush. In March 1837, James Chisholm visited the house his eldest son had built at his property, Kippelaw, 8 miles west of Goulburn. Here he caught a cold that turned into pneumonia. He was driven by carriage back to Calder House, where he died on the 31st of March 1837 at the age of 65. His second wife, his eldest son James Jr., and 7 children from his second marriage survived him. The last child, Edwin, was born 8 months before his death. The inscription on his grave states that he departed this life, leaving a numerous family to lament their loss. He was a native of Scotland and upwards of a 47-year resident of the colony, where he maintained a character which for simplicity of manner and integrity will long be remembered. His widow, Mary, became a successful pastoralist and a businesswoman in her own right. John William, Margaret's grandfather, was the firstborn to James and Mary. John William was born on the 9th of October 1819 at their home in George Street, Sydney. He married Rebecca Stuckey on the 27th of June 1843 at Bungonia near Goulburn in New South Wales. John expanded the Chisholm family holdings over the Breadalbane Plains and beyond through the 19th century, eventually controlling 2 million acres of land in Australia. John died on the 28th of April 1899 in Sydney at the age of 79, and his death was announced in the paper. There passed away on the 28th of April Mr. John W. Chisholm of Kippelaw and Woollogarang near Goulburn at the ripe old age of 79. Mr. Chisholm belonged to the pioneering days. He was born in George Street, Sydney, and for some years was a pupil of the late Dr. Lang, and as a lad had seen men sitting on their coffins while being driven along George Street on their way to execution. After leaving school, he went to Kippelaw near Goulburn, which he managed for some years for his father. At his father's death, his brother James went to Kippelaw, and John went to reside at Mummel. About this time he went to the Albury district and subsequently took up some country and had a station called Myree, a few miles from where the town of Wangaratta now stands. He also visited Port Phillip and saw the site of Melbourne, where there were hardly any houses there, mostly people living in tents. In about 1854, Mr. Chisholm purchased Woollogarang, 14 miles from Goulburn. Here he went in for breeding purebred cattle, and he was one of the first to import shorthorns from England. About 10 years ago, he made his fine property over to his youngest son, Mr. Harry Chisholm. Since then, he resided chiefly in Sydney, spending until this last year a part of every summer in his old home. He married a daughter of the late Mr. Peter Stuckey of Longreach near Marulan. His wife died in 1890. There were 5 children. The eldest daughter was married to the late T.F. Gibson and died in 1888. Their eldest son, John, was found dead on the 1st of April 1887, having fallen from his horse soon after leaving home that morning. This sad event had a great effect on Mr. and Mrs. Chisholm. 1 daughter and 2 sons survive him, Mrs. John Gilchrist, Dr. William Chisholm of Sydney, and Mr. Harry Chisholm. Margaret's father, Harry, was the youngest of John and Rebecca's children, and he was born on the 11th of February 1858 at Goulburn. In 1886, he married Margaret McKellar in Goulburn when Harry was 28 and Margaret 21. Harry created Australia's biggest bloodstock agency that dominated thoroughbred sales at Randwick. Margaret Chisholm wore a Federation dress to the Federation Ball of 1901, and I have a photo of Margaret wearing that dress. The property that Harry's parents bought, Wollongong, in 1854, stayed in the Chisholm family until 1912. Margaret McKellar was the daughter of Alexander Lamont McKellar, who was born in Scotland. He was 3 when he came out to Australia with his parents, Duncan and Jane. And there's a memorial of Duncan McKellar, Margaret's grandfather. Humbly sheweth that Your Excellency's memorialist, accompanied by his wife and 2 children, arrived here a few months ago in the city of Edinburgh, commanded by his uncle Mr McKellar, and with the intention of employing himself in agricultural pursuits. That previous to his leaving England, your memorialist was not aware of the usual mode of proceeding here in order to obtain a grant of land. Under this impression, Your Excellency's memorialist received a letter from Sir Michael Shaw Howard, which was left at the Government House at Parramatta a fortnight since, and which Your Excellency's memorialist must rely upon as a means of obtaining such a portion of land as it may please you to bestow on a man who has been a practical agriculturalist from his infancy upwards, and Your Excellency's memorialist shall in duty bound ever pray. District of Upper Minto, 14th of September 1825. However, Duncan died in November 1838 at the age of only 43. Margaret's father, Alexander, married her mother, Minna Lynn, at St Mary's, Balmain on the 24th of January 1855, and announced that Alexander McKellar, Esquire of Runnymede, Richmond River, to Minna, eldest daughter of Adam Loftus Lynn, Esquire, solicitor of Ballarat, Victoria. Minna died on the 4th of April 1860 at sea on the Lochiel, aged only 26. Alexander then married Margaret's mother, Mary Maud Polly Garrard, on the 12th of May 1864 at the Borey homestead at Tabulam on the Richmond River, when he was 42 and Mary 20, and Margaret was their firstborn. Mary Garrard's parents, Henry and Anne Garrard, were English and they'd owned land at Lismore, New South Wales. So from now on, I will call Margaret Chisholm Sheila, as that is what she was referred to throughout her life. Sheila was raised at Wollongong with her 2 older brothers, John and Roy. As the only girl in a rough, male-dominated world, she often attempted to match and outdo the working men at tasks on the station. Sheila was educated at home. She recalled how she liked to go out further than the furthest man when swimming at Bondi Beach, until she witnessed a man lose his leg in a shark attack. Her family had moved to Sydney in 1912, and she then attended Kambala School for Girls. Sheila was attracted to the arts and had a deep appreciation for Australia's flora and fauna. In her unpublished memoir, Waltzing Matilda, she described her adolescent self as a queer mix of romanticism and boyishness. I was quite unconscious of my looks. In 1914, Sheila and her mother sailed to England on the SS Mongolia. They planned to spend a few months in Europe, but their trip was extended by the onset of the First World War, making the long journey back to Australia too dangerous at the time. On the 27th of October 1914, in the Goulburn Evening Penny Post, it says Mr Harry Chisholm and Miss Sheila Chisholm are in Scotland. They have been staying with Mr Jack Garvin at his shoot in Aberdeenshire. Sheila and her mother travelled to Cairo, where one of her brothers was stationed with an Australian cavalry regiment. Sheila was described by an old friend, Captain F.C. Aarons, as being a good dancer and possessing a sense of humour. She was rather tall, 5 foot 6 inches, with excellent deportment, not prone to cosmetics as she had a beautiful complexion. By the northern spring of 1915, the reality was proving far grimmer than initial expectations, with casualties from Gallipoli Landing arriving in their thousands. Sheila nursed, while her mother ran the officers' club and organised blanket appeals. The city quickly filled with sick, injured and dying soldiers. Her brother Jack was hospitalised with a severe stomach disorder. One day, while visiting her brother, Sheila was introduced to the man convalescing in the next bed. His name was FrancisEdward Scudamore St Clair-Erskine, formerly known as Lord Loughborough, and he was a British officer and the eldest son of a Scottish earl who'd taken a bullet in the shoulder from a Turkish sniper. Although tired of almost constant malattention from soldiers around Cairo, Sheila was immediately struck by Louie's cheerful demeanour. When, after being released from hospital, he later sat with her overnight while she nursed a sick dog, and Sheila fell in love. Louie also fell in love with Sheila, telling her, "I know I am wild, but with your love I will be different. I could do great things." They were secretly engaged a month later, and Sheila ignored the warnings of her mother, saying that she was too young and the decision an over-hasty one coloured by war. Sheila and Louie married on the 27th of December 1915 in Cairo. The wedding of a British peer, heir to the Scottish estate of Roslin, to an Australian commoner, albeit a superb horsewoman who excels as a vocalist, was reported fully in London newspapers. In May 1916, after being wounded a second time, Louis was granted permission to transfer his commission from the naval unit under which he'd arrived in Turkey to the King's Rifles. The new Lady Loughborough left Egypt bound not for Australia, but her new home in London. Sheila's mother's concerns were well founded. Louis had a reputation as a gambler and he'd already been convicted before the war of passing a bad cheque. On the morning after their wedding, he insisted on attending a race meeting in Cairo, where he'd not only lost a month's pay, but all the money given to the couple as wedding presents. He apologised and promised never to do it again, Sheila reflected hopefully in her later private memoir. Almost at once things began to go wrong. Returning to England, Sheila found herself neglected while Louis spent nights gambling so recklessly that his father, the Earl of Roslin, himself a rakish gambler, took out an advertisement in the Times warning that he would not be responsible for his son's deaths. Louis was a pleasant fellow but hopelessly weak-willed. Like his father, being addicted to gambling also came with an addiction to alcohol. His father, the Earl of Roslin, was one of Britain's most colourful aristocratic wastrels. His lands included rich coal mining activities and the famous Roslin Chapel outside Edinburgh, but he'd squandered most of the family fortune on horses, and he'd embarked on an acting career. He'd had as many wives as bankruptcies, but somehow he still retained enough land and position to be a man of influence. Sheila was immediately accepted into society, helped by her unusual, languorous beauty and her colonial heritage. Her heritage seemed to be regarded as exotic and a welcome change to the string of American heiresses, including Winston Churchill's mother, who'd married into British society. Family connections helped, of course, as introductions were made by Louis's cousins, the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland. The Duchess, Eileen, was mistress of the robes to Queen Mary, responsible for the Queen's clothes and jewellery, and the pair became lifelong friends. There were others too, like the society beauty and silent movie star Lady Diana Cooper. Cooper's friendship immediately identified Sheila as a woman of style and beauty and someone to be noticed by the newspapers, whose interest in society, its excesses and scandals, was beginning to blossom into almost daily coverage. Then there were the wives of senior politicians who were not always aristocrats but wielded enormous social power. One was Freda Dudley Ward, whose husband William was a senior government official in the House of Commons. Now, instead of tending wounded soldiers in makeshift hospitals, Sheila was waited upon in vast drawing rooms and attended dinner parties and balls in the mansions of Belgravia. Society saw in Sheila a beautiful, confident addition to the set, admiring her for her take-no-prisoners frontier spirit. Privately, though, she was far from happy. Her marriage was already in trouble as Louis disappeared night after night into the elite and male-only gambling clubs of St James and the less salubrious dens of Soho. He continued to make apologies for his gambling but made very little effort to curb his activities, which Sheila suspected included the taking of lovers, a practice considered acceptable in many upper-class households, providing the liaisons were discreet. She remained silent, hoping her loyalty would be rewarded at some point by redemption and change, and she was already pregnant. Anthony Hugh Francis Harry St Clair-Erskine, or Tony as he came to be known, was born in May 1917. In February 1918, at a private dance in Belgravia, where they sought refuge during a bombing raid by German Zeppelins, Sheila's good friend Freda met the country's most eligible bachelor, Edward Prince of Wales, known as David, by his inner circle. She was instantly captivated. The very next day, Edward began writing to Freda, and their affair would endure for 15 years, and it ended only after he'd met the American socialite Mrs. Wallace Simpson, for whom in 1936 as King Edward VIII he would abdicate from the English throne. Shortly after meeting Freda, the prince agreed to attend a ball that Freda would be attending. He brought his brother, the shy Prince Albert. Freda also brought her friend Sheila, who, as she was about to meet the royal brothers, whispered to Lady Rosemary Leveson Gower how she should react. Her advice was, curtsy to the ground, call them sir, and treat them like dirt. Sheila danced with the two brothers that night, both of whom would be entranced by the young woman, who made no secret of her heritage. She later recalled, she said, it was an enjoyable evening and I told them my grandfather was a kangaroo. Louis's addiction had worsened. His debts were spiralling out of control to a point where he sat on their bed one night waving a loaded revolver and threatened to shoot them all. She got hold of the revolver and calmed him down. But instead of leaving him, she appealed to her father-in-law to save his son and the marriage by finding a way out of the financial mess. The solution was twofold: pay off Loey's debts, which amounted to the modern equivalent of $1.5 million, and get him away from London's bookmakers, perhaps an overseas trip for a year or so. The meeting was followed quickly by several more before Sheila withdrew once again from society to give birth to her second child, Peter George Alexander St Clair-Erskine, who arrived in October 1918, a few days after the armistice. In one of her few comments about the affair, Sheila wrote, "We danced with them a great deal at all the balls, which annoyed some of the dowagers. However, we didn't care. We knew no party was complete without us and them." They often risked discovery at dinner parties and dances, and the princes frequently appeared at Frida and Sheila's houses, sometimes when their husbands were at home. Edward wrote often to Frida, mentioning the affair between his younger brother and Sheila, although he never regarded it as a serious liaison. Sheila owned a small gold cigarette case that bared the inscription, "For Sheila from E," a gift from Edward. Edward missed seeing her when she visited Sydney in 1920. Edward, Bertie as he was known, had fallen in love with Sheila, but his father, appalled when he discovered his son was conducting an affair with a married woman, ordered him to put a stop to it at once in April 1920, and there was a deal done. As long as he stopped the affair, he could have the dukedom. Miserably, Bertie obeyed. Bertie wrote to his brother the next morning, "He is going to make me Duke of York on his birthday, provided he hears nothing more about Sheila and me." Unlike his older brother, the prince agreed to step back into line, and shortly afterwards at a society event, he spied a debutante across the dance floor, a 19-year-old Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, his future wife, and the future queen and queen mother. Sheila then embarked on an affair with a married Russian prince named Serge Obolensky, who appeared in London amongst dozens of aristocratic families escaping the Russian Revolution. He was born a prince in the days of Imperial Russia. His first wife was the daughter of Tsar Alexander II, and his cousin was the assassinated Rasputin. Serge was tall and handsome. He oozed charm and confidence that Bertie lacked, and Sheila found herself conflicted, aware that both were dalliances with little future, given that she must appear to be loyal to her husband. She knew she would lose her sons in a divorce, and no man on earth was worth leaving her own children. In late September 1920, Sheila boarded a ship and set sail for Australia. It was a journey designed to save her marriage. Sheila told Serge, sadly but firmly, that she was putting her marriage first, and said goodbye. On the 9th of November 1920 in the Sydney Sun, rumour has it that the Prince of Wales acted as godfather to Lady Loughborough's elder child. Lady Loughborough intimated was untrue. It was Lord Leopold Mountbatten, a cousin of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was on the HRH's staff, who was the boy's godfather. In England, Lord and Lady Loughborough live in their London house, and at the conclusion of her trip, Lady Loughborough will return there to live. Her husband at present is in India and will probably rejoin his wife in Australia. And on the 21st of December 1920 in the Melbourne Herald, Lady Loughborough reached here in November and attended one of the race meetings during Carnival Week. Her main object in coming to Australia was to make her two young sons and their grandparents acquainted. Her eldest son, the Honorary Anthony St Clair-Erskine, is 3. The Honorary Peter, her second child, is aged 2. Arrangements have been made by Lord and Lady Loughborough to stay in Australia for some months. And then there was a newspaper article on Serge where it says he became infatuated with a married Australian beauty, Sheila, Lady Loughborough, whose father was one of the wealthiest businessmen in Australia. When Sheila went home to Australia to visit her parents, Obolensky decided to go along and try his luck selling grain harvesting equipment in Australia. But in spite of such pleasures as kangaroo hunting, business in Australia did not flourish, and Sheila eventually reconciled with her husband, and Obolensky decided to return to London. So despite her saying that it was over, it sounds like Serge did follow her, hoping that the affair would continue. Louis failed to reward Sheila's loyalty. He disappeared yet again after his arrival in Sydney, this time to Queensland. In his absence, Sheila fielded a number of letters from a heartbroken Prince Albert who was lamenting her departure and possibly his decision to end their attachment. He wrote, "Whenever I go to a ballroom, I always look around the room hoping to see you, as I know there is somebody missing, and it is so sad not seeing you, and I do miss you." On the 31st of August 1922 in the Melbourne Herald, Honorary Anthony St Clair-Erskine. The Honorary Anthony and Honorary Peter St Clair-Erskine are the two small sons of Lord and Lady Loughborough, who are at present guests of Dame Nellie Melba at Coombe Cottage. Lady Loughborough, before her marriage, was Miss Sheila Chisholm, daughter of Mr and Mrs William Chisholm of Sydney. Finally, in February 1923, with no improvement in Lowy's nocturnal habits in sight, Sheila gave in to Lowy's demands and agreed to return to London permanently, arriving a few weeks after Bertie married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Although she had lost two admirers for the sake of remaining with her errant husband, Sheila didn't have to wait long to attract the eye of another man, this time an English baronet, a prominent amateur boxer named Sir John Millbank, whose nickname was Buffles. He was known for his prowess in the ring and was called the Boxing Baronet. She liked this dashing sportsman, but she was determined to keep him at bay. Another that jostled for her attention was the silent screen star Rudolph Valentino, whom she squired around London in 1925 and visited in Hollywood in 1926. When she saw the famous actor again whilst on a visit to Hollywood, where his girlfriend, Paula Negree, furiously jealous of the lovely Lady Loughborough, attacked him so violently that the injured star had to take to his bed for a week. Rudolph kept a picture of her by his bed and he gave her his lucky bracelet. He died just 6 months later, in August 1926, of peritonitis, causing Sheila to think it was because she'd taken his luck. Finally, Sheila's marriage to Lowy did end in divorce. On the 16th of July 1926, in the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate, Loughborough divorce. Lady Loughborough, formerly Miss Sheila Chisholm of Sydney, secured a divorce from Lord Loughborough, Lord Roslind's heir, at the Edinburgh Court of Sessions. The petitioner in her evidence said that after the honeymoon in 1915, the defendant went to Gallipoli while she went to live with her mother in Cairo. Both returned to England in 1916. The defendant drank and gambled and later got into financial difficulties. He went to Australia where she joined him. He promised not to drink but did so and blamed the country for it. They returned to England where her husband committed misconduct. Lady Loughborough said further that her husband always blamed the country, wherever he was and whatever happened. First it was England and then Australia. He became horrid and abusive to her and it got worse each year. He returned from Australia after 2 years because the climate did not suit him and he entered a home for the purpose of a cure. When he came out, the position became intolerable. After hearing that her husband had stayed at a hotel with another woman, she received a letter from him saying he realised that as far as he was concerned, she had had a difficult time in various ways and thought the fair and proper thing was to give her an opportunity of obtaining her freedom. The impending divorce suit in London against her noble spouse will disrupt one of the most thrilling wartime romances, a real-life story of a beautiful nurse and a noble patient. It says that Sheila Chisholm was an exceedingly pretty girl, tall, willowy, a sportswoman, a rider, a skater, and a leader of the fashionable younger set of her day, and was a brilliant figure at big polo gymkhanas and other classy gatherings. Lord Loughborough will not contend the divorce suit. So in London on the 14th of July, it was announced that Lady Sheila Loughborough, formerly Miss Sheila Chisholm of Sydney, secured a divorce in Edinburgh against Lord Loughborough, Lord Roslind's heir. She made Buffles wait another 2 years before agreeing to marry him and become Lady Millbank. They married at the Registry Office in Paddington on the 14th of November 1928. Officially, Buffles was the 11th Baronet of Helnaby, Yorkshire, and was 7 years younger than Sheila. She and Lowy ended up divorcing quite amicably, and so at her second wedding she carried a bouquet of lilies that Lowy had sent her. On the 28th of November 1928 in the Manila Express in New South Wales, Sir John Millbank, the 11th holder of the baronetcy, which dates back to 1661, is 26 and was educated at Harrow and Trinity College, Cambridge. He succeeded his father, Lieutenant Colonel Sir John Millbank, VC, who was killed in action in the Dardanelles in 1915. The great-grandfather of the first Millbank to receive the baronetcy is stated to have been Ralph Millbank, cupbearer of Mary, Queen of Scots. In August 1929 came the news that Lowy was unhappy and confused one night after an evening spent in the company of friends in a house at Holland Park, and he'd fallen 10 metres onto stone from his bedroom window, dying several hours later of his injuries. Sheila had never really stopped loving the father of her 2 sons and refused to believe the coroner's findings of suicide caused by a temporary unsound mind. On the 5th of August 1929, the Sydney Daily Telegraph had announces his death. In London, the death is announced of Lord Loughborough. He was 37 years of age and the eldest son of the Earl of Rosslyn, and married Miss Sheila Chisholm of Sydney in 1915. They obtained a divorce in 1926 and there are 2 sons. Buffels Milbank seems to have been an unrewarding companion, choosing to spend most of his time drinking at White's. A new husband of lesser social stature did nothing to hold Sheila's advancement in society. She regularly attended London's nightclubs and theatres, often seen in the company of stars of the day, including a young Fred Astaire and his sister Adele. In the 1930s, Sheila's life with Buffels was settled. There was little that the Australian beauty, later Sheila Milbank, could do or wear that didn't make an impact in the gossip columns. She was one of the first to sport the new shingle haircut, a bob cut sharply upwards on the nape of the neck, wear a tan or go bare-legged in public. She made headlines when she appeared at a West End dance club wearing a wig of golden-coloured silk. Sheila appeared in the diaries of Sir Henry Channon, nicknamed Chips, a leader of London society who in January 1935 declared her to be calm, lovely, gentle, restful and perfect. With a classic oval face, dark brown eyes and auburn hair, she had a smile like a Lily Court beauty. On the 25th of July 1936, there was a feature in the Australian Woman's Weekly. King's interest in his godson, David Anthony Chisholm, who has the distinguished honour of being the godson of His Majesty King Edward VIII. Tony, who is the 12-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. Roy Chisholm of Onslow Avenue, Elizabeth Bay, is a stalwart schoolboy, quite unspoilt by the knowledge that he's the only child in Australia with a royal godfather. When the Duke of Gloucester visited Australia not long ago, the King, then Prince of Wales, asked him to look Tony up and tell me exactly what he is like. Press of engagements prevented the Duke from complying with his brother's request during this early part of the stay here, but the day before he left he rang Mrs. Chisholm and requested that Tony be brought to the Mascot Aerodrome the next day to see him off and say goodbye to him. Tony's mother, formerly Miss Molly Little, was one of the King's favourite dancing partners when he visited Australia as the Prince of Wales in 1926. Mrs. Chisholm was, however, privileged to meet the Prince in a less formal way than most of his dancing partners, for his introduction to her was the outcome of a friendship with Lady Milbank, then Lady Loughborough, and formerly Miss Sheila Chisholm of Sydney. Sheila Chisholm and Molly Little were childhood friends, and when Lady Milbank, then Lady Loughborough, knew the Prince was coming to Australia, she expressed the hope that he would meet Molly Little. The Prince met Mrs. Little soon after he came to Sydney, and they immediately became friends. He danced with her at many of the big social functions and was a frequent visitor to her home, Brooksby, in Double Bay. In course of time, Miss Molly Little married Mr. Roy Chisholm, the youngest brother of Lady Milbank, and when her first child, a son, was born, he was named David Anthony, the first name being one of the many that the King bears, and the one by which he is known in family circles. Their friendship has continued in intervening years, and it's certain that if Mrs. Chisholm goes to England next year, as it is rumoured, she will see the coronation and the festivities associated with it under the best possible auspices. A later article in the Australian Woman's Weekly purported that the Duke had an affair with Molly Little, and David Anthony Chisholm was in fact his son. However, this was debunked in the SBS program Every Family Has a Secret that was broadcast on the 4th of April 2022, where they followed the descendants of David Chisholm and found that through DNA it was highly unlikely that David was of German extraction, and it seems more likely that he was in fact a Chisholm. On the 14th of October 1937 in the Adelaide News, in London, Lady Milbank, who was Miss Sheila Chisholm of Sydney, accompanied by Mrs. Peter Thursby, will leave for Australia by the Imperial Airways plane on the 21st of October to see her mother. She will remain for a month and then return to England. And on the 3rd of November 1937 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, wearing tailored slacks and no stockings, Lady Milbank, the former Miss Sheila Chisholm of Sydney, alighted at the Kingsford Smith Aerodrome yesterday afternoon on the last stage of her flight from London. Prominent Mayfair hostess and personal friend of members of the royal family, Lady Milbank is here on a hurried visit to see her mother, Mrs. Harry Chisholm, who has not been well for some time. Travelling with her is Mrs. Peter Thursby, who, as Miss Poppy Baring, was one of the most toasted debutantes of her season in London. As they alighted from the plane, Lady Milbank and her companion were welcomed by Miss Marjorie Little, an inseparable companion of Lady Milbank during her girlhood days in New South Wales, and George and Rolly Walker, nephews of the late Dame Edith Walker. As she alighted from the plane, Lady Millbank looked a slip of a girl. Lady Millbank's slacks were of tailored Air Force blue slub linen. She wore a tucked-in shirt-maker blouse of the same fabric with a matching coat, a plaited bandeau on her well-groomed brown hair. Her only ornament was a lovely brooch of diamonds and sapphires. Her 2 sons and husband went to World War II, and Sheila rolled up her sleeves to become a volunteer nurse again, helping her friends Ewan and Barbara Wallace to convert their grand Sussex manor house, Lavington Park, into a temporary maternity facility. She lived in a dormitory with 6 other women and worked 11-hour days, assisting medical staff. It was here in September 1939 that Sheila received a telephone call from Buffles, telling her that her youngest son Peter had been killed. Not in combat, but flying a hurricane above the fields of England in a nighttime accident. It was Sheila's 44th birthday. On the 11th of September 1939 in the Melbourne Sun News pictorial. Pilot Officer Lord Anthony Loughborough, 22, son of Lady Millbank, formerly Sheila Chisholm of Sydney, has been killed in action with the RAF. Lord Loughborough was the eldest son of Lady Millbank, and he was commissioned in the RAF in January 1938. His brother Peter, 21, succeeds to the title. He's also serving in the RAF. 6 months later, she received a cable from her brother in Australia telling her that her beloved mother had suddenly died. She wrote later, "I felt I couldn't bear it, but of course one can." She spent the remaining war years drifting from friend to friend as her London home was peppered and then bombed, closed and then sold. Even as the end of the war approached, Sheila found it difficult to celebrate until Tony and Buffles had returned from Europe, where they were helping to liberate survivors from Nazi concentration camps. When he finally did return, though, Buffles was a changed man. He was distracted and struggling with alcohol. Sheila, tired and heartsick, drifted towards an America that was largely unaffected by the longevity of the conflict. When she came home, Buffles, contrite, admitted he was having an affair, but was determined to give up the woman in question. He would take a trip to Europe, he said, to clear his head and rethink his priorities. She returned to the US to give him space, finding solace with her friends in Hollywood and reconnecting with old flame Serge Obolensky. On the 28th of May 1947, she boarded the SS America, which would take her back to a new life with a husband who'd pledged his fidelity once more. He'd sent her a cable to say that he'd ended the affair and would be at Southampton to meet her. 3 days later, she was told to go to the radio room where there was an urgent telephone call from her son in London. Buffles had been a passenger in a taxi driving through Ghent in Belgium when it collided with a tram. He died of severe head injuries at the age of 45. Sheila inspired British author Evelyn Waugh to write his celebrated 1948 novel, The Loved One. At the end of 1948, Sheila stood alone on the deck of the Queen Mary, and she was once again homeward bound after her 3rd trip to the US in 3 years. At the age of 54, she launched a business, Millbank Travel, with a friend at the famous Fortnum and Mason department store in Piccadilly. Given her name and the size and calibre of her contacts books, it expanded quickly. On the 14th of January 1951 in the Sydney Sunday Herald, Earl shows Paris to his cousin from Alice Springs. In London, a young bachelor from Alice Springs, Mr. Tony Chisholm, left London yesterday to see Paris with his cousin, the Earl of Roslin, who's the son of Lady Millbank, formerly Miss Sheila Chisholm of Sydney. Mr. Chisholm is spending a holiday abroad with his mother, Mrs. Jim Sargood, and Lady Millbank decided that her son should show the night spots of Paris to his cousin before he returned to Central Australia. Lady Millbank is the largest shareholder of the Millbank Travel Limited in Fortnum and Mason. She says most of her work will be moving about London, contacting clients, but next winter, perhaps about Christmas time, I hope to visit Sydney and then go to Alice Springs. Lady Millbank last visited in 1937. By the time she returned to Australia in 1967, she was a successful businesswoman with a staff of 200 and a turnover of $5 million a year. She had also married for a 3rd time on the 29th of October 1954 to a cousin of her old flame, Serge Obolensky, Prince Dmitry Alexandrovich Romanov, at the registry office at St. Marylebone. He was a nephew of the last Tsar of Russia and one of the few family members to escape capture and execution. He escaped Russia along with many other members of his family on board the HMS Marlborough, arriving at Malta on the 20th of April 1919. He'd moved to London after World War I, and although he and Sheila had moved in the same circles, he'd always been in the shadow of more flamboyant suitors, including Obolensky. Now many again almost 4 decades later, and both in their 60s, Dmitry and Sheila found an easy companionship with each other. Their matchmaker had been none other than Wallis Simpson, now the Duchess of Windsor, who was living quietly with David in Paris. She was now known as Princess Dmitri Romanov, and her husband bought a house in Wilton Street, 100 metres from the backyard walls of Buckingham Palace, and near the house where Freda Dudley Ward had her affair with the Prince of Wales all those years before. The couple spent their final years travelling. Interviewed by the press on the coincidence of all of her husbands being titled, she responded with, "I married all my husbands for love. I certainly didn't care about titles, and none of them had any money." When she spoke to the media at the Sydney airport when she visited in 1967, talking of Australia, Sheila said, "I've missed Australia very much. I dream about it, you know. I can smell it quite clearly in the wattle and the gum trees." So the Canberra Times outlined her visit on the 10th of January 1967. Princess Dmitri Romanov, formerly Miss Sheila Chisholm of Goulburn, arrived at Sydney Airport today with her husband on a brief visit to Australia. The Prince and Princess will spend 2 days in Sydney and then travel to Canberra, where they'll stay with the British High Commissioner and his wife, Sir Charles and Lady Johnston. Prince Dmitri is a cousin of Lady Johnston. His father, the Grand Duke, Alexander Mikhailovich, was an admiral of the Imperial Russian Navy. The Princess married him in 1954. She was born at Wollongong Station near Goulburn. And there was an article in the Australian Woman's Weekly as well when they visited. "You are going to marry me," said the nephew of the late Tsar of all the Russias. "No," said Australian-born Sheila Chisholm. "Yes," said Prince Dmitri. Now, ordinarily, a no from that very forthright lady meant what it said, but this time Prince Dmitri Romanov won the day. The pair flew into Sydney this month on a kind of sentimental pilgrimage, the princess to see her native land again and the prince to discover Australia for the first time. They are both lively, down-to-earth, no-nonsense people, united by a sense of fun. But when you talk to them, the air seems to fill with the ghosts of long ago of a glittering world, with the sound of far-off trumpets, the swirl of beautiful court dresses, and the flash of light on ceremonial swords. Princess Dmitri Romanov was the youngest child of Harry Chisholm, who bred fine sheep and finer horses on an immense station 40 miles outside Canberra. "When I first left Australia just before World War I, Canberra didn't exist," said the princess. Young Sheila Chisholm was educated privately on the property. She recalls that I was a monster. Mother told me she would never keep on a governess who was unkind to me. So whenever they actually tried to teach me something, I said they were being unkind. Governesses came and went like flies. I wasn't allowed to smoke, but I did at the age of 12. Her mother took her abroad in 1914 to all the glamour of the pre-war season, but the war broke out. Sheila's elder brothers immediately enlisted in the Australian Light Horse. To be near them, mother and sister went to Egypt, and this is where Sheila fell in love with a young Lord Loughborough, eldest son of the Earl of Rosslyn. They were both much too young to contemplate marriage, but secretly engaged until the way was clear. There were 2 sons of the marriage. Lord Loughborough died, and after a time his widow married Sir John Millbank. Once more, Lady Millbank was widowed. Years passed, and then one day her eldest surviving son told her, "I think Dimitri's falling in love with you." "Nonsense," said his mother. "The 2 of us have been friends for a lifetime." But her son was right. Eventually Lady Millbank became Princess Dmitri Romanov, connected by marriage with most of the past and present crown heads of Europe. The prince's cousins, for instance, including the King of Greece, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and Princess Marina. His father, Grand Duke Alexander, was an admiral of the Imperial Russian Navy and the head of Russia's Air Force. He paid 2 visits to Australia and wrote home to his cousin, the Tsar, "If it were not for my duties in Russia, I should never leave this paradise." Prince Dimitri's mother was Her Imperial Highness the Grand Duchess Xenia, sister of the murdered Tsar and of England's Queen Alexandra. His own sister, a great beauty, married the prince who murdered Rasputin. History rings through these illustrious names, so quietly voiced by the prince in a Sydney hotel room. He told me about the terrible 8 months after the revolution when he and his family, including the Dowager Empress, were locked up waiting to be murdered. We slept in our clothes, always hoping to escape. We were starved but not ill-treated. Finally, King George V of England sent HMS Marlborough to take us off. All 6 of the sons of Dimitri's family survived the revolution and are living today either in England or America. She told the media pack when she got off the plane, "I flew back here briefly in 1937 to see my mother. I want to see the Blue Mountains again and a koala farm. I want to surf again to see if I can surf without being knocked over. And I want to meet all my old friends again and have Dmitri meet them." This pair, no longer young, who played glittering roles in a glittering past, are firmly on the side of the future. Sheila died in October 1969, at the age of 74, from a combination of heart failure and lung cancer in London. Shortly before her death, a young relation visited her in hospital and found the room filled with their old friends, all in fits of laughter. They were spitting cherry pips in the air like children. It was like a party, like they were celebrating her life. She was cremated and her ashes scattered in the grounds of Roslyn Chapel. And her inscription reads, Margaret Sheila McKellar, Princess Dimitri, beloved wife of H.H. Prince Dimitri of Russia and mother of the 6th Earl of Roslyn, 1898 to 1969, in ever-loving memory. Her oldest son, who became the Earl of Roslyn, commissioned a stained-glass window of St Francis of Assisi, surrounded by animals, which can be seen through the chapel's baptistry in 1970. In a nod to Sheila's Australian heritage, there is a kangaroo in the bottom left-hand corner of the window. In 1950, Lord Roslyn also added a stained-glass memorial window in the baptistry in Roslyn Chapel, dedicated to his late brother and to his stepfather, Sir John Millbank, 11th Baronet. A woman of style and fashion, Sheila was an outstanding figure of the London social scene for half a century. And a little on his son Anthony. Upon his grandfather's death on the 10th of August 1939, and as his father predeceased his grandfather, Anthony succeeded as the 6th Earl of Roslyn. Lord Roslyn was a friend of the future American President John F. Kennedy and wrote to him in 1940 stating, I read your book and I thought it very good indeed. It was beautifully written, though most Americans do not write beautifully. On the 3rd of August 1955, Lord Roslyn married Athénée de Rochehart de Mortemart, the only daughter of Louis Victor de Mortemart, Duc de Vivonne, and Mademoiselle Michael Valérie Olivier. Before their divorce in 1962, they had 2 children, Lady Caroline St Clair-Erskine, who was born in 1856. She married Michael Francis Martin, the only son of Lieutenant Colonel Francis William Martin, the eldest son of Vice Admiral Sir Francis Arthur Martin, and Honorary Avis Irene Venables Vernon, who was the only daughter of Francis Venables Vernon, the 9th Baron Vernon, in 1991, and their other child, Peter St Clair-Erskine, who became the 7th Earl of Roslyn, who was born in 1958, married Helen Waters in 1982. Lord Roslyn died on the 22nd of November 1977 at Midlothian and was buried at the Roslyn Chapel in Scotland. Through his son, he was posthumously a grandfather of James William St Clair-Erskine, Lord Loughborough, who was born in 1986. Also, the actress Lady Alice St Clair-Erskine, who was born in 1988, and the Honorary Harry St Clair-Erskine and Lady Lucia St Clair-Erskine. So I hope you enjoyed the story of Sheila Chisholm, who became a part of the royal circles. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.